two patrons of the Renaissance. One day in the fall of that year, 1460, when Prince Henry the Navigator died, a wealthy Italian banker, Cosimo de' Medici, 71 years old, and his favorite grandson, Lorenzo, who was 11, might have been seen leaving the monastery of San Marco in the city of Florence and walking slowly homeward towards a massive gray stone palace. Their pace was slow, not so much because the old gentleman was slightly lame, as that the two were deep in a conversation about Socrates and Plato. The boy did most of the talking, using his hands in a very lively fashion, and looking up often to his grandfather for a comment or question. The two were great friends, Cosimo de' Medici, the unassuming but most powerful citizen of Florence, and the dramatic young Lorenzo de' Medici, who was to equal, if not excel, his grandfather as a patron of art and literature. About the same time Prince Henry sent out his first explorers, Cosimo de' Medici had begun to make Florence a center for rediscovery of the wonderful art and learning of the ancient Greeks. Both this and the discovery of unknown lands were part of a thrilling change taking place in Europe. People were becoming interested again, as the ancient Greeks had been, in the nature of man himself, in the marvelous world in which he lived. As Europeans were discovering the ancient way of thinking, the change was so startling they thought it was like being born again. And so those years in which this change took place were called the rebirth or Renaissance. The boy, Lorenzo, who was now entering the palace courtyard with his grandfather, had been brought up in the new learning. In the center of the marble courtyard stood a statue of David, made before Lorenzo was born by the sculptor Donatello, who was the same age as Cosimo. This statue was especially important as it was the first one made in modern times that could be viewed from all sides, like the ancient ones being discovered in old Roman ruins. There at the statue the boy and his grandfather parted. Cosimo went to the study on the ground floor. Lorenzo bounded up the flight of marble stairs to the second floor where he was to have a lesson in Greek. His tutor was a Greek scholar, one of many who had fled from Constantinople 7 years before, when their city had been captured by the Turks. They had brought many rare old books and manuscripts for his grandfather's library, and he had put them all to work, copying and translating and teaching. Now that he was 11, Lorenzo's training in public affairs was beginning. This summer, for the first time, his grandfather had him stay in Florence instead of going to their country villa with his mother and sisters and younger brother. Other summers he had spent riding horses and playing games. This was another kind of game he was learning, managing people and money. Grandfather was growing older and tired and needed help. His gout was so painful that he often had to rest in the monastery of San Marco. This morning, after 2 days' rest, he felt ready to cope with whatever foreign affairs needed his attention. The King of France, or England, or some other ruler of Europe might be asking to borrow money for one of their never-ending wars. Power lay in money, and the clever use of it. Lorenzo could see that, and he knew that his grandfather used his money not to make war, but to keep peace among the city-states of Italy. Once, when Venice had threatened to attack Milan, he had loaned to his good friend Francesco Forza enough money to defend Milan and gain control of the duchy. Another time, when Venice and Naples combined against Florence, he called in so many loans made to men of those cities that they had no money to carry out their plot. And who would do it when he was gone? That was what Cosimo de' Medici often thought of as he talked with Lorenzo, who was so bright, so gifted, but so young. Piero, the boy's father, was capable, but he was an invalid and might not live until Lorenzo was old enough to manage. 4 years passed. Lorenzo was 15, spending another summer in Florence. Both his father and grandfather were in the country villa, both very ill. His father recovered, but on August 1st, 1464, Lorenzo heard that his grandfather was gone. Piero was still too ill to come to Florence, so the boy took charge of all the arrangements for the funeral. The Signoria, or city council, had planned a magnificent ceremony, but Lorenzo told them that his grandfather had requested that the service be very simple and quiet. So it was. But a special honor was accorded the man who had directed the affairs of Florence and kept it peaceful and prosperous for so many years. On his tomb in the church of San Lorenzo was engraved in Latin words meaning, "Cosimo Medici lies here, declared by public decree the father of his country." Hardly was Cosimo de' Medici in his grave than plots were being formed by other rich men of Florence to kill Piero, banish the family, and take over the enviable position of power. Young Lorenzo detected a conspiracy headed by Luca Pitta just in time to send a warning to his father and save him from being murdered. The council passed a death sentence on the ringleaders, but Piero refused to have it carried out and merely had them banished from Florence. By his forgiveness he had made his enemy a friend for life, and the Medici position was stronger than ever in the government of Florence. By this act he also won the admiration of his son Lorenzo, who made the wise remark that only he knows how to conquer who also knows how to forgive. And so, although Florence was still called a republic, Piero, like his father Cosimo, became the absolute ruler of Florence in everything but name. As a thank offering for his narrow escape, Piero commissioned a painting for the church of Santa Maria Novella to be made by a young artist, Sandro Botticelli, whom he had invited to live as one of the family in the Medici palace. Botticelli was just 5 years older than Lorenzo. The painting which he made was called the Adoration of the Magi, and was really a painting of the Medici family, showing Cosimo, Piero, and the young hero Lorenzo. Young Lorenzo was also shown as one of the 3 kings riding through a fabulously beautiful land in a painting by Gozzoli, ordered by Piero for the chapel walls of the Medici palace. The old sculptor Donatello died in December 1466. Piero was sad to hear that he was gone, the last of those great artists who had been friends of his father Cosimo. There was Brunelleschi, who had designed the great Duomo, Ghiberti, who had spent a lifetime on the magnificent bronze doors of the baptistry, Fra Angelico, who had decorated the monastery of San Marco, which Cosimo had built for the Dominican friars. Donatello's last request had been that he might be buried now near his lifelong friend and patron, Cosimo de' Medici. Piero saw that his tomb was placed in the crypt of San Lorenzo. Almost the entire city of Florence walked in his funeral procession. Among those who mourned was a former pupil, Verrocchio, who was both a sculptor and a painter, and who himself had just taken a pupil who would prove to be one of the most versatile and gifted men the world has ever known. He was a boy of 14, by the name of Leonardo, who had been born in the little hamlet of Vinci, not far from Florence, and so he was called Leonardo da Vinci. On the first morning that young Leonardo came to the studio with his father, Verrocchio must have been struck with amazement. Could this be his new pupil, or was it young Apollo who had just stepped down from Mount Olympus? Or had he come to pose for the archangel Michael? It did not seem possible that one so talented could also be so beautiful. Later, Verrocchio was to use Leonardo as a model for his statue of David. Verrocchio had already seen samples of the boy's work. Leonardo's father, Ser Piero da Vinci, was a notary, and he had brought a sheaf of his son's drawings to get an expert's opinion of the boy's ability. He was anxious that Leonardo should be educated in that for which he was best fitted. His own profession, the law, did not seem to appeal to the boy, nor was he drawn to reading the classic authors. In all the creative arts and sciences he showed a marked interest and did everything easily and well. In mathematics, for example, he made such progress that after a few months his tutor confessed that he was dumbfounded by his questions. From the time he was a small boy he had stood spellbound by water wheels and mills, levers, cranes, and winches, with endless curiosity as to how they worked. He was always drawing everything he saw, although none of his drawings satisfied him. He would work hard on something, then look at it, turn his head this way and that, and then tear it up and begin all over again. What to do with this versatile boy was a problem. Unable to decide, Ser Piero had brought the drawings to Verrocchio. Upon the master's encouragement, he had signed the usual papers for Leonardo to become an apprentice in Verrocchio's study. One of the first practice drawings Leonardo did was a study of folds and draperies on a seated figure. He first modeled the small figure in clay, then dipped a piece of cloth in thin plaster, arranged the wet cloth in folds, and when it dried and hardened, made a drawing of it with a fine pointed brush. One of the first real assignments was to draw a cartoon or pattern of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. This was for a tapestry to be woven in Flanders and sent to Alfonso V of Portugal. In a busy studio like this, it was customary for an apprentice to fill in the background or even a minor figure in a painting begun by the master. Some time after Leonardo was with him, Verrocchio was at work on a painting on the baptism of Christ. Having done the two figures of Jesus and John the Baptist, he asked Leonardo to paint the kneeling angel in the lower corner and fill in the landscape, while he turned to some other commission. Leonardo's angel was so superior to the figures that Verrocchio had done himself that he saw at once that his pupil had surpassed him. As the story goes, he vowed he would paint no more, and from then on he turned to his real forte, which was sculpture. Piero de' Medici conferred continually with his young son Lorenzo, especially on foreign affairs and matters of diplomacy. One day there was a letter to be answered from the King of France, Louis XI, to whom Cosimo had loaned vast sums of money, long overdue, and which the king could not or did not care to repay at that time, though he made no mention of it. He began his letter by addressing Piero, a man of middle class, as cousin, a term used by kings only in addressing others of royal blood, a neat little bit of flattery. Then he announced that he was conferring upon the Medici family the honorable distinction of adding the French fleur-de-lis to their coat of arms. That was all. But the spidery cunning paid off. The Medici, as he expected, considered this tinge of royalty worth the price of canceling the loan. Louis XI, who became King of France when he was 38 years old, was so sly and wily in his doings that he was called the Spider by his enemies. But he was nevertheless an excellent statesman and one of the most important kings in French history. It was Louis who formed the modern nation of France by subduing the old feudal lords and uniting their lands under the crown. Richest, most independent and powerful of these feudal lords was the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, who far outshone the king at his coronation. This took place in 1461 in the cathedral at Reims. In honor of the occasion, Louis, not one for needless display, did go so far as to get himself a velvet bonnet and coat and breeches of red and white satin. Usually he went about in an old pointed felt cap and gray dusty clothes, like those of a pilgrim. He did often make pilgrimages to famous shrines, as he was very superstitious about the power of bones, teeth, hair, and other relics of the saints, as well as being intensely religious. The night before the coronation, he prayed in the cathedral from midnight until 5 in the morning. By 9 o'clock he was back again on his knees before the high altar. There he remained until the sound of trumpets announced the arrival of the abbot bearing the sacred oil with which he was to be anointed. Louis then rose and the solemn service began. First, the Duke of Burgundy came forward, magnificent in cloth of gold and sparkling with jewels. He knelt and swore his allegiance. He was followed by the Duke of Brittany. These two great feudal lords were completely independent. They were followed by the lesser peers, who each in turn knelt, kissed the hand of the king, and swore allegiance as vassals of their royal lord. The archbishop then took the cruet of sacred oil and anointed the body of the king, who had been stripped to the waist. After this, wearing a sweeping robe of blue velvet embroidered in fleur-de-lis and carrying the scepter, Louis was escorted to the throne. The Duke of Burgundy again stepped forward, took the heavy gold crown, raised it high in both hands, held it a moment, then lowered it gently onto the now divinely royal head of Louis XI. "Long live the king!" cried the Duke in a loud voice, and through the crowded cathedral resounded echoing cries, followed by the deafening blaze of trumpets and the ringing of many bells. In the coronation oath, Louis had sworn to unite the parts of France into one nation. To him, those were not just empty words. He had meant what he said, and he was impatient to be about it. Too impatient. So he was in for trouble. In the first years of his reign, the new king started overly brash and hasty action against the feudal lords, not yet having perfected the technique of gaining his ends with cunning instead of force. The feudal lords, determined to preserve their old independence, took up arms against him, led by Charles the Bold, the new Duke of Burgundy. Charles the Bold, a very different man from his genial father Philip, was an out-and-out warrior, reckless, daring, and fiercely ambitious. Although he owned all the rich and prosperous Netherlands as well as Burgundy, he was not satisfied, but meant to seize another rich piece of French land. Charles was constantly on the warpath, and Louis had to be ever on guard against him. England presented another problem for the French king. Louis had to keep a sharp eye on England. He meant to see that the English did not come back and start war on France, as they had done off and on for the past 100 years. Louis had been 8 years old when they had burned Joan of Arc, after she had helped to crown his father. He was 30 in 1453, when the English had finally given up trying to conquer France and had gone home defeated. Since that time, the English had been fighting at home among themselves. This suited Louis to perfection, since it kept them too busy to think about France. Louis's own cousin, Henry VI, had been King of England when the fighting started, But he had lost his throne, which made no difference to Louis. He did not care one bit who was King of England, as long as he left France alone. Whenever it looked as though this useful fighting in England might possibly be slowing down, Louis intended to give it a judicious poke here and there to get it started up again.